and welcome back to yet another episode of On the Grid Podcast, Season 4, Episode 26. As you may see, it's only me, myself and I for today's episode, as Ethan has gone away on his jollies. So it is just me for this episode, and we'll be looking over the recent Dutch Grand Prix, and we'll be previewing the Italian Grand Prix, which is this weekend in our lovely double header at Monza. As you may know, I'm your host, Adrian Kita. Let's just jump straight into it. Jump straight into things. So let's look over qualifying, shall we? And let's begin with the Q1 exits. So in Q1, it was Daniel Ricciardo, Esteban Ocon, Valtteri Bottas, Guan Yu Zhou, knocked out, with Logan Sargent not participating in the session due to his FP3 crash, which obviously saw the red flag pulled out, and also saw his car in absolute bits, which I'll highlight the news that's on the block as soon as we finish this segment of the episode with the Dutch Grand Prix review. But we know what's happened with Logan Sargent. Was it surprising to see him knocked? Was it surprising to see him involved in another crash like this? Probably not. It probably wasn't really unexpected to see him happen, to see this happen. To see other drivers like Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu out of the session, probably not as well. Probably Daniel Ricciardo and Esteban Ocon are a little bit of a shock with their cars. I mean, Alpine have had a bit of a resurgence, so have VCarb. So it's not really, so it's kind of a bit of a shock to see those two knocked out. But all in all, I don't think the bottom five is very is very different from bottom fives that we've seen in the past. The top three was Sergio Perez, George Russell, and Carlos Sainz. Sergio Perez has shown a little bit of signs of resurgence over the last couple of weeks. And ever since, I want to say ever since the last couple of races on the summer break, I think he's finally kicked on, and he's finally noticed that something is at stake here, and it is his place at the team. But let's move on to Q2. And the big shocks in this session were Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton, with Yuki Tsunoda and the two Hassels of Nico Hulkenberg and Kevin Magnussen also knocked out. Carlos Sainz, Lewis Hamilton, big shocks, big shocks for them two. Now, I don't think many people were expecting it, but we kind of saw the same fate in Canada happen, where the two Ferraris were knocked out and everybody was gobsmacked. And of course, it's not ideal to see those two drivers knocked out, with Carlos Sainz and Lewis Hamilton, as their cars are clearly capable of Q3. But unfortunately, it happened. And I mean, you can't really do anything else about it, can you? So to see those two knocked out, yes, it is a shock. But they made it up in the race, so by all accounts, it's okay that they made it up in the race. And then Yuki Tsunoda, Hulkenberg, and Magnussen, I don't think those three were expecting to knock on the door of Q3. They obviously gave a good go at it, so it's by all means those three did very well to get through to Q2. But Q3 clearly was a step too far for them. On to Q3, and it was Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, and Oscar Piastri in the top three. Lando Norris delivering a stunning lap, and by all accounts, he showed why the McLaren is the quickest car, why McLaren are simply not going to be stopped for a long time. By all means, Zach Brown did mention in at the end of the race that straight line speed might be a bit of a problem for McLaren, and that Monza coming up this weekend could be a struggle for them. But I don't think it's going to be as much of a struggle as we've seen for Red Bull, where Max Verstappen is complaining about the balance, the car simply not turning, and Red Bull just seemed a bit of a mess. Oscar Piastri to get it onto the second row. He's done a very, very good job. He's keeping on the coattail of Lando Norris, but I think Lando Norris is his experience in Formula One, I think, is kind of edging him away from his younger teammate in the team. Then we obviously had George Russell and Sergio Perez in fourth and fifth to be the lone Mercedes driver in Q3. And I think George Russell did a good enough job to qualify P4 ahead of Sergio Perez, who's, like I mentioned previously, he's having a bit of a resurgence, and he's kind of regathering a bit of his form, trying to somehow claw onto that Red Bull seat. Charles Leclerc, P6. I think the Ferrari wasn't brilliant in qualifying. I think on the Saturday, especially, both Ferrari struggled. And yeah, they weren't at the peak. Fernando Alonso in P7, Alex Albon in P8, Lance Stroll P9, and Pierre Gasly got his Alpine into Q3 and qualified in P10. But the hot points from Q3 were that obviously Alex Albon was disqualified from qualifying due to a technical infringement with his floor. It was millimeters too big, and he was disqualified from the session. And also Lewis Hamilton was given a three-place grid drop due to impeding Sergio Perez in qualifying. But let's move on to mine and Ethan's average driver rating. Ethan has kindly sent me his driver ratings in, so I sort of know what he's kind of what he's going to be looking at. Yeah, the glasses are off now. It's getting serious. So let's look at race winner Lando Norris. Pole position, race win. It's a 10 out of 10 from the two of us. He basically led from start to finish. From the get go, Max Verstappen got him, but then in kind of as the laps ticked on, Lando Norris was using his smart head to pull away a little bit, to pull back a little bit, to not get in the dirty air, and then overtake Max Verstappen when the right moment hit. Not like what happened in Austria. We saw a completely different Lando Norris, and by lap 18, Lando Norris was ahead of Max Verstappen. So myself and Ethan, especially with that 22-second gap to Max Verstappen, it's the clearest 10 out of 10 I think we've given all season. Moving on to Max Verstappen, the two of us have given him a 9 out of 10. It's still a very, very good race in Zandvoort for Max Verstappen, but without a shadow of a doubt, I think Max was aiming for a victory in Zandvoort to kind of complete the set and to continue his dominance at his home race. But unfortunately, it wasn't to be, and it was Lando Norris who took the victory. But nevertheless, it's a fantastic podium, well ahead of Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri in third and fourth. So it is a 9 out of 10. Moving on to Charles Leclerc, the aforementioned Charles Leclerc, he gets a 10 out of 10 from the two of us. Couldn't get any higher than third, but held on to that third place so well. He was literally fending off Oscar Piastri for the last 10 or 15 laps, and did so very, very admirably. He gets another podium, and similarly to I believe it was Miami. Um, it was Charles Leclerc. The Miami Grand Prix was the last time Lando Norris won a race. So the last time Lando Norris won a race, it was Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc on the podium, and it was the same again. Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc on the podium, and Charles Leclerc gets a 10 out of 10. Moving on to Oscar Piastri, we've had a bit of a dispute here with Ethan. Obviously qualifying in P3, Oscar Piastri, but he finished the race in P4. I gave him an 8 out of 10. I think he still did a very, very good job. He still had to come through the field. He was kind of put onto a very, very alternate strategy, which saw him had to make a couple of moves to get himself back into podium contention. but unfortunately, he wasn't able to get onto the podium. I gave Oscar Piastri an 8, and Ethan gave him a 7 out of 10. Um, I don't know what Oscar Piastri could have done. Charles Leclerc did very, very well to fend him off. I don't think he was as good as Lando Norris. I think the car just simply didn't work for Oscar Piastri, especially with him being on that alternate strategy. I think McLaren shafted him a little bit, kind of butchered his chances of him getting a podium. Um, but nevertheless, it's still a good performance and there's still valuable points for the team as they chase Red Bull down in the Constructors' Championship. And talking about Red Bull, it's not Sergio Perez. We're talking about Carlos Sainz, who arguably should be a Red Bull driver, but he's not. Um, he qualified in P10, finished P5, making up 5 places. I've gone with a 9 out of 10 for Carlos Sainz, and Ethan has gone with an 8 out of 10. I don't think Carlos, apart from that appalling qualifying, which obviously saw him start in P10 due to Hamilton's grid drop anyway. Apart from that poor qualifying, I don't think Carlos Sainz could have done any more. He was slowly closing the gap to Oscar Piastri in the closing stages as Oscar was trying to overtake Shaw. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to get himself in P4 and make it a 3-4 for Ferrari. So I think arguably him or Shaw, I think should have been nearer the driver of the day. Lando Norris obviously won it with the popularity contest. But no, I think Carlos Sainz consistently shows that he's a top driver. Williams are extremely lucky to have him. And yeah, he deserves the 9 out of 10 that I gave him and the 8 out of 10 that Ethan's given him, which balances it out to an 8.5 out of 10, which I'll accept. On to Sergio Perez, qualified P5, finished in P6. I gave him an 8 out of 10. Meanwhile, Ethan gave him a 7 out of 10. Look, Sergio Perez is slowly getting back to probably his best. He's slowly getting his qualifying performances up, which is important for Red Bull if they are to continue, if they are to challenge for the constructors' crown. Like at the beginning of the season, Sergio Perez was well off it, not gaining many points. And I think these sort of couple of races that are coming up now are crucial. The Monza, the Azerbaijan, those 2 races are extremely important for Red Bull if they are to keep a hold of the constructors' crown by the end of the season. Because I think with these circuits, and especially with like a Singapore and a Qatar coming up, those races are going to be very tricky for many teams because they require a lot of downforce, and I don't think they require as much straight line speed as people will have for Monza, for example, where most of the track is high speed. I believe you're going high speeds probably about half the time at Monza. So without a shadow of a doubt, Sergio Perez needs to continue these performances coming, and I think a couple of podiums will be necessary for Red Bull and for Sergio Perez to keep him at the top of the championship. But moving on to George Russell and Lewis Hamilton, who finished seventh and eighth respectively. George Russell started fourth. Meanwhile, Lewis Hamilton started P14 after his grid drop. Um, I gave Russell a 6 and Hamilton a 7. Meanwhile, Ethan went for a 5 and a 6 for the 2 drivers, respectively. I don't know whether he's got a little bit harsh. I know the qualifyings weren't brilliant, especially with George. I think his race pace was completely off, and he was arguably the worst of the 2 Mercedes drivers, with Lewis Hamilton being on a alternate strategy, starting on the softs and then putting the softs back on in his 2 stop strategy. But I just don't think it was Mercedes's weekend. They just didn't seem to have a grasp of the car at all. And they were looking backwards. They weren't looking forwards. They had a very very hard time of it. in Zandvoort. So a 6 and a 7 from me, and a 5 and a 6 from Ethan. Moving on to Pierre Gasly, who obviously qualified 10th, but moved up to ninth after Alex Albon was disqualified and finished the race in ninth. I gave him a 9 out of 10, whilst Ethan gave him an 8 out of 10. I think Pierre Gasly, especially with him being the leading light at Alpine from next season onwards, he needs to deliver all the goods and all the points for Alpine for the remainder of the season for them to see that he is the right man to lead them forward. And he certainly delivered that in Zandvoort without a shadow of a doubt. Had a very, very good race, and kind of just was in his groove. Let's not forget this guy was on the podium last season at Zandvoort, in a much better car. Don't get me wrong, but points for Alpine are imperative for them to gain that sponsorship money and for them to kind of find a way to counterbalance these struggles that they had, especially from the start of the season. On to Fernando Alonso, who qualified seventh and finished 10th. I gave him a 7 out of 10, and Ethan also gave him 7 out of 10. I think it was from Fernando Alonso's standards, and as Lawrence Stroll said, he was expecting double points for Aston Martin. It wasn't meant to be, but Fernando Alonso did deliver a point for Aston Martin, and I think that's also an important point for them because they've also had a very, very hard time recently, and the more points for them, the better. This team was up there challenging inside the top three. Fernando Alonso, multiple podiums last season, and the car's just simply gone backwards. So for them to get points and for them to capitalize on that points kind of that points finish is a very, very is a very good feat. Don't get me wrong, he probably should have finished ahead of Pierre Gasly, because arguably Pierre Gasly's in a worse car, but Fernando Alonso drove a good race, a stellar race, and finished inside the points. Nico Hulkenberg up next. He qualified in P13, but got bumped up to P12 due to Hamilton's grid drop. Um, and and Alex Albon's little fiasco. And he finished the race in P11. I gave him a 7 out of 10, and Ethan gave him an 8 out of 10. I think for Nico Hulkenberg, he's a similar type to Carlos Sainz, very, very consistent, uh, doing what he does best, missing out just on points, but still had a very, very stellar drive, and was arguably one of the better drivers, one of the shining lights in Zandvoort. On to Daniel Ricciardo, who finished in P12. He made up a couple of places, and both me and Ethan gave him a 6 out of 10, sort of average, because you're expecting Daniel Ricciardo to do so much better purely on the basis that his race seat is on the line. I don't know whether the carb didn't have it in them because Yuki Tsunoda did finish 17th. So he's at least beaten his teammate and outqualified him. No, not outqualified him, sorry. He beat his teammate but didn't outqualify him. He beat him in the race, but in qualifying, Yuki Tsunoda was out on top. But I think most of the drivers from about 12 downwards kind of had mediocre races, similar to Lance Stroll, who had a subpar race, especially when you qualify in P8, and finish in P13, losing a handful of places. He did qualify in P9, but obviously Alex Albon's disqualification bumped him up to P8. And to lose 5 places when you're starting inside the top 10 is just not a good look, especially when both Aston Martins qualified into Q3 and made the effort to get into Q3, but just weren't able to convert that top 10 start into points. Only Fernando Alonso clawed onto those points places, but he still lost 3 places from where he started at the beginning of a race. So it kind of shows a little bit of uh, let's say race. I don't want to say race mismanagement. I think the car for Aston Martin was more focused on qualifying and not the race, if we put it that way. Because for like we have the example with Ferrari where their car was very much focused on the race but not qualifying. So you have vice versa. You have this kind of dissimilarities in the team, and I think Ferrari played it right, whereas Aston Martin played it a little bit wrong. Maybe they were gambling on a safety car to come out or something like that, and it just did not come. So that's Lance Stroll in P13. Alex Albon in P14, he gets a 6 out of 10. Sorry, let's get the ratings for Lance Stroll. So I gave him a 5, and Ethan gave him a 4 out of 10. Let's move on to Alex Albon, who, of course, was disqualified from qualifying, and he started in P19 as Guan Yu started from the pit lane. Alex Albon was able to make up 5 places, and he got a 6 out of 10 from the two of us. Obviously, very, very unfortunate to be disqualified from qualifying for a little bit of a technical infringement on his floor, which obviously is not his fault. Arguably, the team should have done a more thorough check on the parts whilst they were fitting them on, for those kind of mistakes to be eradicated. But as James Val said, it was literally millimeters that cost them. So to come back and make 5 places is good going. But Alex Albon arguably wanted more, and I think he was on for points if he did qualify in P8 like he did. I think he would have been on for points, and I think he will be a little bit dissatisfied after what happened in Zandvoort, and will be wanting a return to the points in Monza. On to Esteban Ocon, who qualified in P16 and finished in P15. I gave him a 6 out of 10, whilst Ethan gave him a 5 out of 10. Once again, I think most of these drivers below Daniel Ricciardo kind of had average races. They, I don't think, I don't really think they impressed me a lot. I know Kevin Magnussen was overtaken by about 4 cars at once, and I think Esteban Ocon was one of them. So. I mean, Esteban Ocon, Logan Sargent, Yuki Tsunoda were all battling for places, and Esteban Ocon came out on top in that battle for P15. Whilst Logan Sargent finished in P16, and he obviously did not start in qualifying, finishing P16, making up a couple of places there. He got a 5 out of 10 from me and a 4 out of 10 from Ethan. I think the damper on his weekend was that crash in FP3, which sort of put his whole weekend in jeopardy, let's say. But he was able to race and able to finish. But as we all know, he won't be racing with us again after this weekend. After the weekend in the Netherlands, of course. Yuki Tsunoda qualified in P13, but got bumped up a few places due to Lewis Hamilton and Alex Albon. But he went backwards. He just completely went downhill. And I gave him a 5 out of 10, whilst Ethan gave him a 4 out of 10. Just wasn't the weekend for Yuki Tsunoda. Wasn't brilliant. Wasn't fantastic. Was well beaten by his teammate. But he'll move on and kind of reset heading into Monza. And then we have Magnussen, Bottas, and Zhou, who I all gave a 4 out of 10 to, because they were essentially the back of the field. They didn't really impress me much. They were just going backwards. Ethan gave Magnussen a 3, Bottas a 5, and Zhou a 4 out of 10. Yeah, those 3 drivers didn't really impress me much. Well, we saw Magnussen getting gazumped by about a gazillion cars. That was probably the most excitement that Kevin Magnussen got that weekend, getting overtaken by cars. But that rounds off our average driver ratings. Let's kind of recap our ratings for the Dutch Grand Prix. So let's look at Ethan's side of things. So if we look at Ethan's side of things, in qualifying he predicted Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri, George Russell, and Lewis Hamilton. So we correctly predicted Oscar Piastri and George Russell. And in the race, he correctly predicted Lando Norris and Max Verstappen to be first and second, with Oscar Piastri in third, Lewis Hamilton in fourth, and Charles Leclerc in fifth. But it was in fact Leclerc, Oscar Piastri, and Carlos Sainz who rounded off the top five. In his star predictions, he predicted a double Aston points and a red flag in qualifying. Neither of those happened. Aston Martin got themselves in the points with Fernando Alonso, but not with Lance Stroll. And I don't believe there was a red flag in qualifying. Meanwhile, I predicted in qualifying Lando Norris to get pole position. I predicted Oscar Piastri, Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc in second, third, and fourth. I got Oscar Piastri, Max Verstappen the wrong way round. Charles Leclerc was sixth, not fourth, and I correctly predicted Sergio Perez to get fifth in qualifying. And in the race, I predicted Max Verstappen to win the race, with Lando Norris in second, Charles Leclerc third, Oscar Piastri fourth, and George Russell in fifth. So I correctly predicted Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri. I predicted Max Verstappen and Lando Norris for the wrong way round, and George Russell was not in the top five. It was actually Carlos Sainz. And in my star predictions, I predicted Haas to get into the points. Unfortunately, they didn't with Nico Hulkenberg narrowly missing out. And I also predicted Max Verstappen to win at home, which he didn't, which was unfortunate. But both of us got 4 out of 10, so we were level on that. But let's move on to let's say a bit of news because we've had Logan Sargent being axed from Williams. Franco Colapinto replaces him, the Williams reserve driver. Is it a good move for Colapinto? Of course it is. It's a positive move. He's only going to put himself in the spotlight now, ahead of a potential move somewhere else. He's obviously been in F2, and he's not going to be featuring in F2 anymore. So his chances of potentially winning the championship is over in that category. But it's a positive step for him. He obviously drove in that Williams car in FP1 at the British Grand Prix, so he's going to have a little bit of knowledge about the car and where it's at, especially with Logan Sargent's car. Um, it's a shame to see Logan Sargent go, but undoubtedly, I've been saying for a numerous amount of weeks that he simply does not cut it at this level. And Franco Colapinto will arguably take this chance with both hands. Whether he grasps it, I hope so, because he could potentially do a Liam Lawson and return to a different team in 2026, for example. I think 2025 seats are very limited. I don't think he's going to have a chance of getting on the 2025 grid, but in 2026, we could possibly see Franco Colapinto step up if he does show his qualities in that Williams seat for the rest of the season, like Liam Lawson did, and especially like Oliver Behrman did in Saudi Arabia, showing the team where he's at and what his talent and his capabilities are. But let's have a look at our predictions ahead of Monza. So let's start off with Ethan's predictions. His two-star predictions are a Ferrari DNF, which I'm hoping does not happen, and he predicted Alpine points, whereas I've predicted a Ferrari win, which I think will be poetic because we're at Monza this weekend, and I predicted V-Car points, whether that's Yuki Tsunoda or Daniel Ricciardo. On to Ethan's predictions for qualifying in the race. He predicted Lando Norris to qualify on pole, with Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, Max Verstappen, and Oscar Piastri run off the top five. And for the race, he predicted Lewis Hamilton to get the win over Max Verstappen, George Russell in third, Lando Norris, and Oscar Piastri running off the top five in fourth and fifth. Meanwhile, I predicted also Lando Norris to get himself pole position, with Charles Leclerc in second place, Max Verstappen in third, Oscar Piastri in fourth, and Carlos Sainz in fifth. And the race, of course, I've predicted Charles Leclerc to win the race with Max Verstappen in second, Lando Norris in third, Carlos Sainz in fourth, and Lewis Hamilton in fifth. Let's round off the episode with a bit of Formula 2 and Formula 3. They're back this weekend after their lengthy summer break. F3 is a hotly anticipated championship, especially with the championship being very tightly contested with Leonardo Fornaroli, Gabriele Maini, Luke Browning, Arvid Lindblad, and Dino Beganovic separated by just 29 points. I mean, the gap between Fornaroli and Browning is only 6 points, and the gap between Maini and Fornaroli is 1 point. Who win the championship? If I had to guess, I'm gonna put it on Miney. The Premier driver, I think he will get the championship. I think he's obviously not been as consistent as, for example, Fornaroli and Browning and Arvid Lindblad, who came out of nowhere with a double win at Silverstone. But I think Miney is going to snatch it. I think he's going to get a win in the sprint race and then maybe a points finish in the feature to clinch the championship. But on to F2, Isaac Hadjar leads the way by a gap of 36 points. Is that a get? Well, I mean, there's still a couple of races to go in Formula 2, but Gabriel Bortoleto is the closest challenger to Isaac Hadjar, with Paul Aaron falling to third place. Paul Aaron, the early championship leader, has simply just faded away. I don't know how it's happened. He's just lost his consistency. He had that whole consistency throughout the start of the season and up to about the midway point of the season, and then he's just lost it. He got a couple of pole positions, but wasn't able to convert them. That's kind of seen him fall away and sort of just languish just ahead of Zane Maloney. He's only 13 points ahead of Zane Maloney, so anything could happen also in the battle for the top three. But Isaac Hadjar is definitely the man to look out for in F2 with Bortoleto hot on his heels. But I think Isaac Hadjar is the man to stop in Formula 2. That rounds off episode 26 of On the Grid Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed my little episode where I've kind of been by myself. This is obviously hopefully on YouTube. This goes out as the video version. I think we're going to trial something else to see what it's like, to see what your guys' thoughts are on this, to see whether you like it, to be quite frankly honest, to see whether you prefer these video versions to the audio versions that you get onto YouTube. So I do hope that you have enjoyed this episode. Make sure to hit a like. Make sure to follow our Instagram, our TikTok, our X, all that good stuff. We'll be back. Well, I'll be back next week. I don't know about Ethan. Hopefully he's back next week as well. We'll be reviewing the Italian Grand Prix back and recapping that in a lot more detail than just me talking about all the drivers. I'll actually be able to maybe take a step back and able to just answer a few questions from Ethan when he does come back from his well-earned rest. But like I say, we'll be back next weekend. We'll be back next week, should I say, as we'll be reviewing the Italian Grand Prix. Thank you for listening to my little rant, my little review of the Dutch Grand Prix and my Italian Grand Prix preview. We'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.